Apologies again for the unfortunate situation that's developed. I am still in the hospital, and at least I have like a really nice view. Oh, you can't see it. You can see Pikes Peak out of that window, but I'm wearing my uniform underneath and everything, and it doesn't look like I'm going to be coming out today. So I decided that rather than leaving you stranded and watching movies without any explanation, I'd give you a little bit of the equivalent of the lecture that I had been preparing and saving for us. The thing is, I'm going to try to cover all the material that we have missed starting on Thursday last week when you watched The King and His Movie, and then Caballos Salvajes, and then also what you watched yesterday, which was, or I'm sorry, Nine Queens, and then yesterday, Pizza Birra Faso and Mundo Grua, Crane World. And I hope that you had a chance to look a little bit or to see or understand, following Falikov, sort of the transformation in the development of the film industry in Argentina. The ones from last week, Caballos Salvajes and Nueve Reinas, responded more or less to the developments or transformations that had to do with the industry being basically run by the state in a manner that tried to meet the expectations of the market, right? The idea was that if the state was going to try to develop a film strategy, then that strategy had to follow somehow a little bit of a commercial model, and also something that would somehow support the position of the state, right? That is, that wouldn't criticize or wouldn't make the government look terribly bad, or wouldn't make again the level of corruption, etc., look terrible. And then Nine Queens, which was probably the more commercially successful of all the films, which was actually a private funded film, and Bielinski, the director, who sort of emerged as this very interesting figure of filmmaking in the Argentine market, who was someone who wasn't really trying to do things one way or another. He just wanted to make like a good film, although inevitably the political sort of gets entangled in there, although not as much as in the others. So let's start first of all then with A King and His Movie, which is a film that I really, really enjoy. It was the first movie by Carlos Sorin, a filmmaker that would later on become a much more artistic director, someone who would be much more in favor of, again, trying to develop film as an artistic form, as a way of reaching the audiences and reaching the public through storytelling, and through, as I mentioned in my writing, a lot of that allegorical connection, right? We talked a lot about how the film could be read either as an allegory of the politics of Argentina, that nation that was being formed, that was growing, that was emerging at the time, and also as an allegory of the difficulties of filmmaking, right? The idea of depending on this whole sphere of business, all of these different levels of financing and basically, again, show business that made it so difficult for the vision of someone like David, the director in the movie, to bring the project to fruition. And then also at the same time, of that beautiful nature of art, or the beautiful spirit of filmmaking as an art, which David also represents, and which has to do with trying to find all of the different elements that are going to make this project come true in a way that fulfills a vision, and that communicates a message that that the filmmaker has. Um, so in that sense, that film, which was from the mid '80s, right? It was made a year or two after the official story, the film that we watched, um, is a film that is still functioning within the realm of the traditional, as we have mentioned in class, of the traditional grammar of filmmaking. Right? There is a structure, there is a grammar to it, there's a beginning and there's an end. There's a lot of sort of unexpected things that happen along the way, but it is a film that we can follow, that we can, as an audience, sort of identify with, in terms of it being something that is filmic, right? In terms that is something that we can that we can see. Um, it is it is the model of some of what the public filmmaking industry went through. The idea also was that the financing was going to come partly from the government and partly um, from the private sector, and the idea also that in depending solely on the private sector, films and filmmakers' visions um, were fairly handicapped, in the sense that they became dependent on a structure, and especially on a financial structure, that put them at risk as an investment, but also and especially as an artistic vision. One of the things that I find more attractive, more interesting about the film is that at the very beginning of the film, and then also at the very end with the following project, David is making the rounds not only of the financially available spaces, but also of the cultural spaces, right? He goes on TV, he appears in these TV shows that are obviously sort of geared towards audiences that are going to be watching films. So there's an attempt at a dialogue with the audience even before the film is taking place, and there is also an attempt at explaining the film to the audience even before the film takes place. The idea is that you're massaging into your audience these processes, right? Um, so that's one of the things that I liked about it. And then, of course, as a comedy, as a comedy of errors, as it develops, and the characters are not right, and the environment is not right, and the people who are supposed to participate in the film are not right, and the people who are participating in a certain way don't agree with the people who are participating in a different way in the film. Again, the conflict between the people who are lending the spaces, the Doctor Bonanno and the crew don't agree in their morals, and so on. All sort of begets this chaos, right? I find the film very, very appealing, very charming, and very again symbolic, very interesting, very realistic of what the challenges of the industry were at the moment. And I hope you enjoyed it. I haven't had a chance to look at your reviews, but I'll take the time to look at them in the next couple of days. The next film that I want to discuss then is Caballos Salvajes, Wild Horses. And if you look at that film in comparison to A King and His Movie, it's a film from a little bit later on. But also, if you look at it in comparison to the official story, I hope you're able to see some of the similarities. So the film is developed by the public industry with support from the private industry in Argentina. And so what's coming at play in that enterprise, right, in that business, is the attempt at creating a relationship between a film that is commercially appealing and a film that has something to say in favor of the government. Again, as Falikov is telling us, at that time in the 90s, there is a lot of social tension in Argentina. There's a lot of corruption, but the government is very focused on trying to make sure that films make a financial statement, that films are able to be released in a way that is independent. Inevitably, because of the financial issues in the film, I'm sorry, because of the financial issues in Argentina at the time, because of the issues that had to do with corruption, and especially with the world of finance, we can see that is something that comes into play. But if you notice, even though even the police chief is somewhat corrupt, there is somewhat is corrupt. There is an attempt at putting the blame for everything that is happening sort of on the private sector, right? It's the banker that is bad. It's the banker that is cheating this man out of his wife's cancer treatment money. I mean, how much more melodramatic, how much more tragic can you get than what these greedy bastards from again, the private industry are doing to these hardworking fellow who's politically very progressive, etc. And then how that impacts too morally on the young banker's character, who eventually then becomes sort of this hero, right? Someone who is, again, working for the private sector, someone who is involved in the private industry, someone who is again finding himself on the wrong side of the political, but not of the political, of the social and economic spectrum, if you want. In a way, taking us back also to the situation that Alicia was living in La Historia Oficial, right? The idea of, here is someone who wasn't aware of what bastards these people that I'm working for really are, right? And how evil they are and how they are mistreating people. I'm young and I'm up and coming and I'm ambitious and I shouldn't be letting, and my ambition is not letting me see or maybe is not interfering with my ability to, or is interfering with my ability to see what bastards these people are that have given me a job and that are making me, do these really bad things. I didn't know any better is the same message in a way that we were having in La Historia Oficial, that it's repeating itself again, sort of under this management in the Menem years, right? Of course, the dramatic level of the story to me is a little bit complicated, and it makes it unpleasant to me, even though the film was extraordinarily successful in Argentina with audiences. They saw it as something that really spoke to the people, and they filled up the theaters to go see it. But at the same time, it is appealing to a social harmony that is not necessarily there. That is, Fernando Solanas, right, the guy who directed The Hour of the Furnaces, argument against this movie would have been, this is completely alienating. What this is doing is taking the people that are being victimized by the system, and it's giving them a story to make them feel better about their situation, even though, they're sort of falling in the entrapment of the same situation. Similarly, in the film, one of the things that I find more interesting is, again, the film takes us into Patagonia, right? Into the area of Argentina that is outside of Buenos Aires, but it doesn't take us to to the oppressed regions, to the racially segregated areas, to the socially and economically ruinous regions that Solanas shows us in his documentary, and that we're going to watch also tomorrow or the day after in the other documentary by Solanas that still exists. It goes into Patagonia, into an area that is remote, that the Argentines, in sort of their founding mythology of the 19th century, called the desert, which was an area that was inhabited only by Indians and was mostly sort of peaceful and abandoned. It's the same region that the Indians in La Película del Rey, A King in His Movie, inhabited. But here, if you see it, it's basically an empty space. It's an empty space inhabited by a few hardworking people who are also victimized by the economic situation, right? They give away the money in the exploding bag. I can't remember exactly what that image is, but where they rescue the girl as well. Everyone is happy with these with this dynamic duo of wrongdoers, right? Of Robin Hood-esque characters. The girl, of course, joins them, very blue-eyed and very blonde and very fair physically, but also a rebel like they are, and they go off to see the wild horses, right? The wilderness, the place where nature meets whatever, the humanity of the universe, and therefore where humankind is able to re-find itself in this utopian space that has very little to do with the urban reality. Remember, we had been talking about that contrast between the urban and the rural, but it also has very little to do with the reality of the oppressed that Solanas had presented us in the Hour of the Furnaces, right? We really haven't met those people anywhere in any of the other films that we have watched so far. The director of the film is Marcelo Piñeiro, who became very, very famous for this same kind of film. The other film he made that made him very, very famous was called Tango Feroz, Ferocious Tango. And it was the story of Tanguito, who was a early 1970s sort of rock star, pseudo rock star, urban rebel who was into this bohemian lifestyle, and that supposedly stood up with his lifestyle against the dictatorship in the earlier years, ended up in jail, and then he died. I think he either OD'd or died of AIDS in the early 80s, or maybe in the late 70s. But it was a similar sort of, again, rock and roll story. One of the things that happens in Caballos Salvajes also is that you have this soundtrack that is very appealing to Argentinians of that era, of that age, of the post-dictatorship. It was a time of a boom in Argentine and Latin American rock. It was the emergence of the MTV generation and so on. And so that made that film, again, that gave that film another avenue for commercial success. The idea of the landscape, of the open landscape, of getting out of the city in your car and going on this extravagant excursion, it's about a 48-hour drive from Buenos Aires, from the capital, to Patagonia, to where they end up with the wild horses. 48-hour continuous drive, maybe a little bit more. But that idea that there is this virgin space in Argentina still to be left inhabited, still where people have traditional values and where you don't have to involve yourself in all of these nasty commercial enterprises that bring about, again, corruption and the evil of the imperial wrongdoing, of the financial wrongdoing, of neocolonialism, as Solanas would put it. Um, when I show the film in class in the past, it's always been one of the students' favorites, but it's also one that once I point out and of course once we read Falikov and we point out all of his shortcomings, then it brings out again what are some of the shortfallings, what are some of the elements of the industry, especially you could say of the national industry, right, of the government supported industry, that allows for this to balance out. At the same time, there's this sort of anti-banking feeling that maybe the private industry is also involved in, but if you read between the lines, there is no specific sort of universal wrongdoer in all of this. It's greed, and it's human nastiness that drives this corruption. It's no one in particular, and that's very common. That's very peculiar. That's very attributable to that period of time as well, right? It's not a business that corrupts people. It's human nature that corrupts people, and so you can't blame the private sector. You have to blame the individuals, which again, it counters Solana's argument in a lot of ways, not in a lot of ways, in all ways, for we had seen, but it also counters a lot of what was happening politically in Argentina in terms of the restoration of democracy and the return of Peronism to power, and this whole process of reprivatization of all public industries. Okay, and that takes me then also to the third film, which is Nine Queens, which is a lot of times one of people's favorites, because it's a film that doesn't compromise in many ways. And that's one of the things that Falikov points out, and that I think it's important to point out in relation to, again, the purely or almost purely privately financed enterprise, right? Patagonic is the film that is the company that emerges at that time to make these films, and Patagonic has financing from outside of Argentina. It's not just Argentine money that it's at play here, and that maybe also has a role in the way that the film is able to criticize, right, the political situation in Argentina, but also sort of the dirtiness of the private sector as well. The idea that greed is greed drives the film throughout on both sides of the spectrum. There's just good greed and bad greed, right? There's greed that is driven by money hunger, and then there is greed that is driven by family and by love, I guess, and one is revenge and one isn't. I guess you could say the same of Caballos Salvajes, of Wild Horses, as well, right? There is this process in the two films where the idea of robbing the bank in order to get back your money that is yours and that they had taken from you, in Caballos Salvajes, a lot more dramatically for the cancer treatment of the wife. In Nine Queens, because of this family dynamic, this toxic dynamic of the family that ends up being the driving force behind the sting, right? There's if you get Netflix, it just came up. There's a 1970s movie with Robert Redford and Paul Newman called The Sting, which is very much what Nine Queens is based on in terms of its plot. It's a story of revenge where the crooks are taking revenge on other crooks that are even crookeder than they are. It's got a very cool ragtime theme to it as well. But in Nine Queens, then again, where we find ourselves is in the urban environment, right? So we are in Buenos Aires. We have white characters. We have white and Jewish characters, but the Jewish characters in the Argentine realm are still white, are still urban, are still European, still have sort of this European model of point of view, and so their goals and their ethics and their vision is similar to the one of the port city dwellers, as Solanas would call them. So in that sense, the movie is still one that is in dialogue with the internal dynamics of the country, we could say, right, with the internal dynamics of Argentina, but that it's challenging, or it's bringing us to this dilemma that is, if we're all crooked, then where is that going to take us? And in order not to be victims, perhaps I'm kind of improvising here, and I'm on drugs at the moment. So, if this process of stealing from one another, maybe that's where I'm going with it. If this process of stealing with one another is taken to its ultimate consequences, as it is with the family of the guy who's robbing the bank, then where does it take you, right? You're stealing from your own. You're victimizing yourself in the end, and therefore you deserve what happens to you in the end, which is what we're witnessing in the final scenes of that movie when the guy is going to cash his check, is that the bank system has collapsed, is that everyone has stolen so much from everybody else that the entire country simply collapses into itself, and it becomes then the lesson of the process of this process of appropriation, right? Of this process of stealing. You are taking stuff from your own. And in the end, in that process, then you're only damaging yourselves. And the only ones, and I mean, in the end, nobody wins, because the money that the people are making is really the money that belonged to them in the first place, right? The whole gang meets together in this very urban, very Argentinian environment, which is called a conventillo. It used to be the places where very large families and immigrant groups would live. It would be like a building that occupied a whole city block, and it had this, it was a 2-3 story housing structure with a central park, a central patio, where people would sort of sit out, and there was a lot in early Argentine theater and early movies, a lot of romance movies that happen in this environment, which is what the film then is also taking us back to, right? Is this spirit of the nation as an immigrant nation, as a nation of hardworking people, just like we saw in the official story, and just like we saw in Caballos Salvajes, and in many ways just as we saw in the story of the king and his movie, of David and this guy who wanted to go into the desert and wanted to transform, wanted to create this utopian country, and of course ran into all of these problems that were, again, social and political and economic, just like all of these guys in the contemporary world is. However, again, Bielinski, the very young director, very young, he was in his late 30s, early 40s when he made his movie, only got to make one more movie that was a crime story that happened in Patagonia, in the area where the Wild Horses story ended. Also with Ricardo Darín, the guy with a beard in Nine Queens, is the guy who becomes the constant presence in every other film from Argentina, and every other commercial film from Argentina that is made from the non. We will see him in a couple of the later films, in the last two films that we'll watch for the class. But he's become, again, if you remember I was telling you the guy in Official Story, the guy who played Roberto, ends up is the guy who plays the Argentine guy in all other movies. In earlier Argentine movies, Darin becomes the guy who plays the Argentine hero in all other movies. And if you see him, he's got a very non-ethnic look. He's relatively white, but he's got dark hair. He's got Italian, Spanish physiognomy, and he's got blue eyes too, which is also interesting. I mean, these are all different things that we need to be looking at in the makeup of the movies. And so that takes us to again that era of commercial and national filmmaking being something where there's a certain requirement of filmmakers to create a certain commercial success with their stories, right? To develop certain stories. I think there's a clip in one of the Canvas modules that I hope you have had a chance to see, which is the one that starts with this truck driver that arrives in Brazil and is playing a soccer game with some Brazilians, and the Brazilians are taunting him because he's an Argentine, and of course he's wearing he has his soccer boots in his 18-wheeler cab, and so he brings out his soccer boots and plays the Brazilians who play dirty, but he still defeats them, and then he has to run away in his cab in his 18-wheeler with his other Argentine friend, and they run off and they fall off the bridge. And it's a fantastic action scene, but it's really ridiculous. Personally, I think it's really ridiculous. It was very commercially successful in Argentina. But again, that plays with all of the blockbuster mythology that is expected of any foreign film. It has no political appeal whatsoever. It's got this nationalistic appeal to Argentine through soccer and through machohood, long-haired, bearded, gaucho-looking dude who defeats the nasty, violent foreigners in his quest for whatever you can call it, soccer justice or something like that. Those are the films of the 90s. And of course what we began watching yesterday, Monday, and we'll be watching for the next couple of days today as well, is the reaction of some filmmakers and some filmmakers really to that idea that national filmmaking really needed to concentrate on making money. Okay, and so yesterday you watched Pizza Birra Faso and Mundo Grua, and I want to start talking about those a little bit, and then we'll finish talking about the one you're going to be watching today, which is La Ciénaga, which is again one of my favorite films. What happens in the 2000s is that the industry, basically the Argentine film industry, is collapsible. There is no value. Argentine films are not doing anything in the national markets. They're getting beat by American blockbusters. They're not getting financed to compete internationally because the storylines are not money making. The private circuit sort of circulates some movies in the international markets, like Nine Queens, but they're not festival movies. International movies for an international market tend to be sort of indie films, and this is something that begins to happen also with American movies. There begins to be a market for films that are visually challenging, that challenge the audiences in their storytelling, that are not blockbuster movies, that are movies that are there to try to connect the audience to its reality and to make the audience realize that its reality is a lot harsher and it's a lot more difficult and it's a lot less, I don't know, Kardashian than what the films have been showing to them, right? That the corruption and the greed are not something that is exceptional in the country, but something that is visible in the fabric of the state. The men in government collapses in this just really apotheosic way. I mean, it's Dantesque. Menem marries some woman who had been Miss Universe. He's accused of laundering money, drug money through arms dealing. He drives a Ferrari. It's just ridiculous, the level of corruption that has come to the country through his just maleficent government. It is just disastrous. And at the same time, I mean, this would be fantastic if he did this and something good was happening to the country. But as you will see in tomorrow's documentary by Solanas, no, what Menem did, which was privatize the public enterprises, was basically selling them to either his cronies, people who got to buy these businesses from him for pennies on the dollar, have the Argentine treasury pay for the rest of it with the money of the few left Argentine taxpayers, or selling it to international corporations, therefore shuffling away, sucking away the profits that these very profitable companies really were producing and that were somehow sustaining then the state. And so what happens in the 2000s, and we see a little bit of that in Nine Queens, is that there begins to be a form of filmmaking that promotes, on the one hand, a more realistic vision of Argentina as a filmmaking state, and then on the other also a more realistic way of representing it through film. Remember, in the first day of class, we had watched that documentary by Michael Shannon about the new Latin American cinema, which was the new Latin American cinema of the 1960s. In the 90s and in the early 2000s especially, there's a new Latin American cinema, which is this Latin American cinema then that is trying to represent reality in a different way. Pizza Virrafaso and Mundo Grua are two films that try to do that in somewhat of a different way. Pizza Virrafaso draws on the one hand, on the aesthetics and the ideology of Italian neorealism. Remember, we had looked at that genre in Shannon's documentary. We had talked about it and Shannon had talked about it as the cinema of the oppressed, right? The idea of showing the reality of the people whose lives are not the lives of the upper middle class, bourgeois middle class, like the bank teller, etc., but the life of the working class, and not the life of the working class as crooks as they were in Nine Queens, right? As somewhat good crooks, but crooks nevertheless, nor as sort of secondary characters like the gas station attendants who in Caballos Salvajes who helped the duo, the Robin Hoods, to escape, but rather the everyday life of those. And remember, we had also talked about neorealism as this genre then that brought on for example, non-professional actors that set the stage for a more grainy. We also talked about it in terms of the cinema of hunger, if you remember, a more grainy, a more difficult, a more gritty way of looking at reality. And if you look at both films, you have some of those aspects in both. In Pizza Birra Faso, in the different characters that populate the film, who are also very young, contrary to Rulo, which means curly, in Mundo Grua, who's a 40-something, who's also a very realistic character, but lives in sort of a different, in a different social world than the kids in Pizza Birra Faso. The kids in Pizza Birra Faso, remember we had also talked about kids, right? The blank slate, the people who don't have a story, the people who we cannot really blame for their circumstance, who are in many ways the victims of what's happening to them. One of them is El Cordobés, right? He comes from a different state in Argentina. He's immigrated to the city. He has no other way, or he finds no other way of making a living, and so it's a way of confronting Argentina with a reality that is very somber, but that it's very real. I mean, again, crime, juvenile delinquency, murder. This sort of apparently random crime sprees that were taking place, robbing restaurants and things like that, were simply a part of the inability of people to find or to have a much more educated and a much more resourceful way of finding their way out of things. With the type of economic collapse that we see at the end of Nine Queens comes the type of economic circumstance that we see in Pizza Birra Faso, right? And so we have these kids who find themselves in this environment, again, where there's not even a legal, ethic framework. The only person who's relatively ethical in that world, to me, seems to be the lady that they rob, and who is like asking them about their well-being, right? Other than that, everyone is out for themselves. Everyone is robbing each other, and the circumstances are pathetic. The kids are one of the more shocking scenes to me, other than the one where they rob the legless singer, who they know, which is the other thing too, is like they're robbing someone that they know, they're stealing his money, even though they know who he is and he knows them and seems to be like friends with them. Is the part where they are eating the pizza, right? They go out, they buy the pizza, which is the only thing that they have money for, after stealing and begging for the whole day. And one of them drops the piece of pizza, leaves it behind, and someone else comes up and picks it up to eat it. And it's like these kids whose lives we're seeing are not even at the bottom of the barrel in this world that is presented to them. They're not at the top, very obviously, but there is just nothing in this society that is allowing them to find an escape. The escape is, in a way, the escape is this promise of love that El Cordobés has for his girlfriend, and that is going to be taking her away and moving her to Uruguay, to the other side of the river, basically to the other side of the ocean. Immigrating, moving away, going the hell away from that place is the thing that might save their relationship, that might save their lives. And so that the way that the film is made too reflects on that. We're no longer in this sort of high production mode, the slickness of Caballos Salvajes or even Nueve Reinas, right? There's a greediness to the film. There's a lot of, the camera is never very steady. There's a lot of handheld camera movements, which remind us of the documentary films, right? The idea that we, as an audience, are not looking at this sort of from a faraway place, from our seats, looking at happening on the screen, looking at the story, but we're kind of running with the kids. We're right behind them. It's very dark, so we can't really see who is who and what is happening to whom. All of those are techniques that the filmmakers are using to make us, to bring us more into the movie as well, right? To give this more a realistic, sort of a documentary sense, a documentary feeling to the movie. And so that's where we are with a flick. And the other thing that to me is shocking, and I mentioned that in my notes, is that the only sort of eventually the only humanizing element that saves the movie to me is this very filmic resource of the radio operator, the police radio conversation dialogue that is happening at the end, where you hear the sirens and you hear the radio person communicating, and he is saying, there's it's very moving to me. There's a boy who is dead, apparently from a gun wound, either I think it's by the police or by the chase or by one of these things. But it's the idea that El Cordobés is dead, and that someone finally recognizes him as a kid. He's not an adult. He's not someone who is aware of who's aware, but someone who's maybe, even though despite his age, responsible for his circumstances. This is someone who is a victim here as well, right? And so what that is telling the Argentine society, the Argentine audience, is this is a national drama, right? This is how we should be telling the stories of our country. And again, it's a form of film that has some support from the government, that also has some support from private and from international film enterprises, but also that puts the idea of the filmmaker as a socially aware artist on the map, right? And these are going to be films then that are going to make Argentine film very successful at the international level and at the national level, not in the commercial circuits, right? You're not going to go to AMC to see this in 3D in a multiplex, but rather as a national language, as a language of film that speaks to its audience, which is the Argentine public, which go see these movies after all. But it's also showing an international audience about the Argentine circumstance and that reality. And that it's doing it using tools that are not trying to be commercially appealing, that are not using the latest technology to show the world these advances that the country has come to, but rather sort of its shortcomings. And Mundo Grúa sort of does the same thing, but from the perspective of a middle-aged guy, right? Rulo, the protagonist, is this fat guy who had a commercial success with his band in the 1970s or 80s when he was younger, and then he just kind of fell into these odd jobs and is someone who has a relationship and seems to have a kid, doesn't seem to have a partner anywhere visible other than this new one that he finds, and we basically see him struggle through this midlife crisis. And to me, in that sense, then it's also in many ways, on the one hand, an attempt at artistically representing the social reality of the Argentina of the 90s and the early 2000s, but also serves as a national allegory, right? It serves as this idea of Argentina, this country that was so promising and that has such economic potential, and that simply sort of let itself go. Notice that Rulo, again, is not someone who's left himself go through corruption or anything like that. And maybe that's also a reflection on the Argentine audience, but that's left himself go through apathy in many ways. He's sort of made do, which is something that, again, we can go back to. We can go back to the official story, to La Historia Oficial, and look at and think, well, this is what happened to the Argentine middle class. It sort of let itself fall into this by not paying attention to what's happening around it, right? Rulo, therefore, at this point in his life, which is kind of the end-ish, because the doctor tells me, look, dude, you're too fat, you've rock and roll too hard, and so it's time, you need to slow down, but you can't really slow down because you have this kid and you have your mom that depends on you. You kind of have to find a way to live. And it's a story that sort of tells itself out of nowhere. There's a little bit of an arch in Pizza Birra Faso, which is a little bit the love story and the attempt at resolving the dilemma of the girl's pregnancy, perhaps, and the idea that, well, now we need to make a stand because life really is taking shape now, right? Now it's time to grow up in a way, and you just don't know how. In Pizza Birra Faso, you have to take the girl away, right? It's like, if you want to start over, if you want, you want love, you want that love to redeem you, you want that parenthood to redeem you, then you just need to remove yourself from this hellish space that the city of Buenos Aires represents. In Mundo Grua, perhaps it's a lot less dramatic, and that maybe slows the action and slows the pace of the film quite a bit more. There's really nothing, there's really not much happening, and there's really not much changing from the beginning to the end of the film, right? And that sometimes is what builds a narrative arc. So we're breaking with that dynamic, and we're left then as an audience to sort of ponder what it is that is going to happen here, what it is that is going to move us forward. And from that style, then we move to today's movie. I have about 8 more minutes to talk to you about this. I don't want to take up much more time than that. So there's a group of Argentine filmmakers, one of whom is Sorin, by the way, is the director of The King and His Movie. But the other one is this extraordinary director, Lucrecia Martel, who comes from the north part of Argentina and who participates in the early 2000s, late 90s, 80 to 2000s, in a series of classes of production workshops. That's the word that I'm looking for. Of workshops that filmmakers are making to try to find new voices in Argentine filmmaking. And Martel and Sorin and a group of others, including the guy who made Mundo Grua, are coming out of that world. And their goal is to create, to exploit sort of the visual elements of filmmaking. It's no longer about, sort of having a very structured story that leads you from point A to point B, but really to take not just the visual, not just the imagery that film is able to bring to you, but also all of the other things that you can play with when you're making movies that have to do with time and with silence and with moving in one scene, from one moment in one place to another moment in another place, and creating then these silences that force you to fill in the blank, as we were talking about in the first day in class, right? You are the audience member. The director is taking you from this scene to this other scene, and there seems to be some connection between the two, but you're not too sure what it is, and you're not really being told what it is, right? Or you're being given slight hints through dialogue or through music or through noise or through something that someone says to someone else at a different point, or through noises that the screeching chairs and the thunder and the raindrops and the dogs barking, or the kids screaming. All of these elements that make up a film that usually you expect as an audience member to be given to you as a package so that you can sit back and relax and enjoy, and are suddenly being given to you sort of jumbled up in a way that is incomplete, and that requires you to fill them in, and that requires them to fill you them in a way that sometimes is even somewhat personal, right? It's like, well, and you're going to see that in today's film La Ciénaga, The Swamp, right? It's the story of this middle class family that's lost everything. It begins to be a common theme in Argentine movies we've seen, that obviously have a business in the capital city, and that business is based on whatever they grow in this villa that they have in the northern part of the country. But it's a villa that is completely run down. It's very dysfunctional, just like their own family is, right? And we see that in their dysfunctionality and their alcoholism and the way they mistreat one another, and in the bizarre relationship between the kids. And we try to find what it is that ties the film together. And it's very difficult. I'm the first to admit it, right? It's a film about dysfunction, and it's a film about waiting, and it's a film about pools that don't work, and it's a film about kids that could shoot their eye out, and maybe they don't. But it's also a movie about humanity, and it's a movie about adolescence, right? There's Mommy, who's the girl who's sort of at the center of the film, who is just completely confused. She seems to be confused about her family, about her relationship with her family, about her own sexuality, maybe, just about the human dynamics around her. There's a lot of racism, as you will see in the film. There's just a lot of stuff that doesn't really fit. And the filmmaker's role then, and this is sort of, again, the new cinema of Latin America, as we will see, is to create this environment so that the audience is going to be the one that is going to bring the story together. And so I invite you, I'm not going to have the time to put it on canvas, but my invitation to you is to think about the human relations in this film. There's also an interesting relationship between the brother-in-law, the man whose girlfriend has a daughter and a little son, and he's sort of trying to make this new second family sort of work out. Very emotional, very, very raw. And we don't really understand exactly what it is that's going on. And there's rain, and some guy is singing, there's music coming from upstairs. And then within all of this, there's also this, sort of miraculous apparition of the Virgin Mary that is taking place in some village. There are a lot of common elements between this film, which is taking place in the northern part of Argentina, outside of the city, and a lot of the things that Solanas was telling us about in the Hour of the Furnaces. So I invite you to make those connections. And again, I apologize for not being here. I hope that this small lecture gives you a hint. I will prepare another one for the next film and for tomorrow's documentary. Hopefully, though, I'll be able to give that to you personally. But if not, it will be also here on YouTube. I'm going to go ahead and download this and upload it and put the link in there for you. And I hope you enjoy the films, and you're enjoying the class, and you keep thinking about these things in these terms. And I'll create a couple of other discussions for you guys to give me your ideas, because I think that a big part of this then as you can see, is the part that we play as an audience, right? The filmmakers are no longer just hoping that we're going to sit down here and we're just going to laugh at this, or we're going to forget about our troubles for a few minutes or think about where our next vacation is going to be. It's really to get us thinking. It's really to make us think, not just about the life and the circumstances of the characters and or of the characters and their country of Argentina and so on, but our own circumstance, and how the world where we live, it echoes, all of this echoes in the things that we do. So thank you very much and have a wonderful day.